A very good evening and welcome. We start with 1 minute invocation to Sri Aurobindo, on whose 150th birth anniversary. Here we are holding this webinar series. So this is the first of the series of the webinars that we will be holding through the year, culminating in an on-site festival and conference next year at the Gnostic Centre, Delhi. The theme of the series and the webinars is manifesting Sri Aurobindo's vision. Today, it gives me great pleasure to present the topic, Key Ideas of Sri Aurobindo that the society needs. I'd like to begin with introducing our esteemed panelists. We have with us Devdip Ganguli, who will begin the presentation with his talk on the conditions for the coming of a spiritual age. This will be followed by Michel Danino, who will speak on the interesting topic, this obstinately Asuric humanity, and then followed by Gautam Chikermane on his topic called unity. I think the panelists are very well known, but a few words might be in order for those who are listening to them for the first time. Devdip lives in Pondicherry. He has, of course, been teaching Sri Aurobindo's philosophy to undergraduate students at the Sri Aurobindo International Centre of Education, and has recently co-edited with Gautam an interesting book called Reading Sri Aurobindo, Penguin Edition 2022, which has excerpts or chapters written on all the most important works of Sri Aurobindo, which has been introduced to the wider public for the first time. Devdip is also, has contributed and is taking study circles at the Gnostic Centre, as you all know, on the life divine. And as our birth anniversary closes in on the 28th of March, he was one of the few who had brought the relics from the Sri Aurobindo ashram to the Gnostic Centre. Next, I'd like to introduce Michel Danino. Michel is on the board of the Auroville. He's the governing board of Auroville right now. A very interesting and challenging task. But a little about him. He's a French-born Indian writer, and his lifelong interests are in Indian civilization. He's authored books on the proto-historical culture and India's future, on the trail of the Saraswati, and is also taking multi-instructor courses on Indian knowledge systems, which has aroused much interest across India. His recent courses have been perspectives on Indian civilization, introduction of the history of science and technology, and the Indian systems of ethics. He's on several boards and has received in 2017 the Padma Shri from the Government of India. We welcome him for the first time as a panelist and speaker to the Gnostic Centre very warmly. I'd like to then introduce Gautam. Gautam Chikermane is the Vice President at the Observer Research Foundation. His areas of research are economics, foreign policy, the Mahabharata, and Sri Aurobindo. His new books, as I mentioned, include Reform Nation, HarperCollins 2022, and Reading Sri Aurobindo, co-edited with Devdip. Gautam has spoken at the Gnostic Centre. His wife is even better known than he is. She has been speaking on the topic of money and wealth. And I welcome very warmly Gautam on the panel today. With that, a few words on the format of today's session. We have the beginning, the panelists speaking, about 12 minutes each. And the second round, after they finish, there would be comments, questions from the panelists and from the moderator, followed by concluding remarks from the panelists, and then a question and answer session, which is open to all of you. So you can ask your questions. And when you're listening to the panelists speaking, it might be a good idea to put your questions in the chat box, because then, we can take them up from there. Those who would like to write them down, those who would like to just raise their hands and ask them, we could also do that. So with that, let me invite Devdip to begin with his presentation.
Thank you to the Gnostic Centre for the warm welcome and for hosting this evening's discussion. I want to get straight into an idea that those of us who are in contact with Sri Aurobindo's writings and ideas are familiar with. It is the most important contribution of Sri Aurobindo, in a certain sense, to the philosophical approach of Indian thought and culture, namely the reconciliation of the two opposite spectrums of consciousness, matter and spirit. He, in his seminal philosophical work, which is The Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo begins the text with a discussion on how there have been two approaches in the East and the West, very broadly put, where the East has focused on the spirit almost to the detriment of a hold on material reality, and the West has been much more concerned with development of matter, science, technology. And in Sri Aurobindo's vision, as we are aware, there has to be a coming together of these two approaches. There are two assertions from the Upanishads, one which says one without a second. There is one reality without any other, or there is one fundamental existence. And the other assertion is that all this is the Brahman. And there has to be somehow a reconciliation between the two, where this aspiration of man towards the divine has to be related to the descending movement of the divine, in Sri Aurobindo's words, leaning downward to embrace eternally its manifestation. So in our approach, the stress on reconciling these two is fundamental. From there, I want to move to the human cycle, especially in terms of how this approach relates to our collective societies. Now, the human cycle is a text which puts forth Sri Aurobindo's social and political perspective. And towards the end of the human cycle, we have a series of chapters which speak about the spiritual age, the coming of the spiritual age, the conditions for the coming of the spiritual age. And that these chapters are full of profound insights, which can give us a little direction in very confusing times. I apologize for the background noise. I think there is something passing on the road, but anyway. So when we consider the importance of these perspectives, we recognize that in our evolving spiritual approaches, there has to be a greater acceptance of various aspects of our being or various aspects of collective life, which we don't normally associate with spirituality. There is a tendency that we consider spiritual that which is familiar to us in the form of spirituality. But in fact, all the different parts of of our human life, all the different parts of our being, which include the physical, the vital, the dynamic, the emotional, the aesthetic, the ethical, the intellectual, the psychic, each of these have to be seen as instruments for a growth towards a diviner living. In this perspective, not only is the entire individual taken up as something that has to be transformed, but also we start looking upon other people, other cultures, other societies, nations from the same standpoint, which means that we begin to see that each individual, each collective entity is a representation of that infinite truth. In a world where we are increasingly divided by perceptions, political standpoints, religious perspectives, and various other divisions, I think for those of us who are inspired and drawn to Sri Aurobindo, this is important to remember that behind these challenging divisions which have to be addressed, I don't think we can gloss them over because they exist. But behind these divisions, there must always be a perception that we are all expressions of the multifaceted, diverse reality of the ultimately single divine existence. Now, coming more specifically to some of the indicators that Sri Aurobindo provides in the human cycle to tell us about the coming of these spiritual ages or changes that are meant to occur, he stresses repeatedly on liberty. And for the remainder of my time, I want to speak a little bit about the idea of liberty as a necessary precondition for any kind of spiritual change that is envisaged. Spiritual transformation, as it is perceived in the light of Sri Aurobindo, is not something that can be imposed or something that can be taught in the sense of a practice. It has to be something which grows from within, which is a natural consequence of the temperament and character of each individual and each collectivity. And therefore, a large liberty becomes essential for the growth of human society towards spiritualization. And this liberty is something which even encompasses all the parts of our nature, which are traditionally not necessarily seen as being part of the spiritual impulse. And so this growing inner freedom has to be honored, which is not to say that anything is permitted. Freedom is not to be confused with license. And at the same time, there has to be a certain purity which is contingent for that freedom to manifest. Having said that, in each of the domains of knowledge, for example, some of the domains that Sri Aurobindo refers to, philosophy, psychological thinking, arts, poetry, painting, sculpture, music, ethics, these are all domains in which he says there are likely to be the first indications of changes coming into play because they are much more receptive and plastic in a certain sense, though he does not leave aside politics or economics. Even in science, he speaks about discoveries that would thin the walls between soul and matter. In the field of religion, he says the coming of the spiritual age would mean that religion would strive to reject its heavy weight of convention and tradition of the dead past. And so any kind of change which takes place, which seeks to renew itself, seeks to reform itself on the basis of a spiritual perspective, would lead us in the direction of a spiritual age. Another very interesting idea that he speaks about is the distinction between mental idealism and spiritual realism. Mental idealism is something that we are familiar with because in a sense it has been at the forefront of all human change and progress. but it is also something ineffective if it remains only as mental idealism. For idealism to convert itself into spiritual realism, there has to be a transference of the will in us. And this is the last idea I want to end with. The idea of will has been taken up by philosophers over the last few hundred years. In the West, we have Nietzsche and many others who have spoken about how the will to be, the will to power, the will to knowledge, these are all ways in which our modern societies have been shaped. We find in these pages, towards the end of the human cycle, Sri Aurobindo's discussion of how most at the individual level, the will is essentially closely tied into the vital being, the implicit will, which is central to life, is mostly situated in the vital and the physical. Its drift is towards the enjoyment of these planes and parts of being. But the key step that is necessary is an upward transference of this will, which means to consciously situate the will in a place of aspiration. When that happens, when there is a change in the main power of our living, is when there can be a leap or an ascent from the thinking mind to a spiritual humanity. This transference of will is also contingent on the discovery of our true selves, of the soul within, of the psychic being within. So in summary, what we are saying is that in this reconciliation of spirit and matter, which is central to Sri Aurobindo's thought, there are a number of intervening stages that have to be taken up and addressed both individually and collectively. And this is a complex and long journey for us as humanity, but it begins with understanding that there must be, one, an acceptance of the totality of the human being, and two, the importance of a growth that is based on freedom, that slowly moves from freedom to greater freedom in the measure that we are able to purify and perfect our nature. And finally, that there is a sense of unity which is underlying this quest. The more we are able to stress upon true freedom, true unity, and move towards this discovery of the true self, we will be preparing ourselves for the coming of a spiritual age. So I think my time is up, and we can continue this conversation after all the other speakers have spoken.
Thank you, Devdip. Thank you for your illuminating comments. Some of the ideas we will take up again after we hear the other speakers. May I now invite Michel?
Thank you, Ameeta, and thanks to the Gnostic Centre, Ritika also, and the whole team for having me tonight. It's a strange feeling of having to work out important ideas of Sri Aurobindo to help this humanity through to the next stage, because it's as if we have all the knowledge, but we're not sure how to put it into effective action, and that is the whole challenge. So first of all, I'd like to thank Devdip for reminding us of very important central truths, which in a way contain everything. But I'd like to start perhaps from the other end of this scale of things. And, you know, when I was invited to speak, and I usually hesitate to speak about Sri Aurobindo because I'm not always convinced of this usefulness, but I thought that if we look at the world today, if we look at the political tensions which are growing, not lessening, we're not going visibly towards an era of peace, of world union, and so on. if we look at the way humanity interferes with the natural environment, then we have enough cause to be pessimistic. And we also know that pessimism is not a solution. It's not going to help us. But nevertheless, the appearances are so contrary to what we should be aiming at and what humanity should be moving towards that we have to ponder. And I was reminded of Sri Aurobindo's phrase somewhere, perhaps in the first decade of his stay in Pondicherry, when he spoke of this obstinately Asuric humanity. So we seem to have some inherent contradiction. We have, on the one hand, an obstinately Asuric humanity, and all we need to be convinced of this obstinate nature is to open the newspapers every day. And on the other, we have all these great ideas, and the age of spirituality, which Devdip reminded us, this ideal of human unity, and basically this move of the whole creation towards a next age, which Sri Aurobindo assured us would see the appearance of the manifestation, rather, of a higher principle beyond the mind. So how do we work out this transition? How is it going to happen? How can we help towards it? These are the big questions which I think this 21st century in particular is going to have to face. And Mother also said it in her own way. She said she had this famous, very concise and very compelling statement when she said that the only hope for the future is a change of man's consciousness. And the change is bound to come. But, and everything is in this but, it is left to men to decide if they will collaborate in this change, or if it will have to be enforced upon them by the power of crushing circumstances. Now, this was in 1964, so 60 years ago. Now, after 60 years, can we say whether humanity has decided whether it will collaborate or whether it will have to be enforced by the power of crushing circumstances? And later on, towards the end of her life in this physical world, she spoke of the lesson of catastrophe, that people understand only the lesson of catastrophe. So this is the whole critical brinkmanship. And I think Sri Aurobindo somewhere uses this term of the terrible strategy of the eternal, a kind of brinkmanship. We are really on the brink. There is no doubt about this. And I think the more conscious we are of this, and perhaps the more effective we can be. We have to realize the extreme criticality of this species, which is deploying its best abilities, its greatest talents towards destruction. We can see it at the level of the environment. And for those of you who follow, I follow very closely because I have been very concerned with environmental issues. And for many years in my early stay in India, I was deeply involved in forest conservation and so on. But apart from that, I've been always, for some reason, very sensitive and terribly hurt and pained at the way we treat our own mother nature. And we are, of course, the only species endowed with destructive abilities on this scale, and the only species not wanting to realize that we are just busy destroying our own habitat. So we have the ability to realize it, but we don't want to look at it. So there is a deep contradiction once again. We see the most, that Mother said that, and Sri Aurobindo, of course, in his book, The Mother, how money should be a force at the service of the truth. Again, we see pretty much the opposite happening, and we see all the world multinational businesses, transnational, supranational is the right word, very busy amassing more and more wealth and enslaving humanity in their perverse system. not realizing that this is going to end in a, again, massive destruction and nothing else. And we have also intellectuals trying to make sense of it all. There, of course, we have all shades, and we do have profound thinkers, especially I found them, for those who are not familiar with who've never heard, let us say, of Sri Aurobindo or this line of thought, I have found the deepest thinkers among those who look at the future of the environment and how we relate to nature, how we deal with it. And this is where we have found powerful statements that, you know, only a deep cultural and spiritual change will save us from this environmental catastrophe. So there have been many people, I will not take time quoting them. And they are the lights, in a way, they are the rare lights in this intellectual world. Otherwise we see a lot of speculation, I mean, academics, about, you know, concepts like post-humanism, which on the face of it might be very attractive, because that's, Sri Aurobindo also, you know, said man is a transitional being. So in a way, he was the pioneer or the champion of post-humanism. But what today is meant by post-humanism is something absolutely different. It is simply a technological future where we fuse into technologies like artificial intelligence, like, you know, robotics and so on and so forth. And this is what post-humanism is supposed to be. And if you look at it objectively, this is a completely Asuric vision. Again, there is no deeper foundation, no deeper value into any of this. So we have, therefore, a critical situation, which apparently, if we go by appearances alone, is not going to mend itself, unless, once again, we have crushing circumstances intervening. Is this what will happen? I'm no prophet, and I'm not at all trying to prophesy, but what I am also reminded of Sri Aurobindo's vision in Savitri, of, you know, darkness deepening and strangling the earth's breast. You may all remember this sentence: when darkness deepens, strangling the earth's breast, and man's corporeal mind is the only lamp. As the thieves in the night shall be the covert tread of one who steps unseen into his house, because it is his house, it's not actually ours. So I think that the key is in this strangling, this suffocation. This is, to me, what is clearly at the individual level, and hopefully at an increasingly collective level, when we see the growing amount of pain and misery and suffering spreading on the globe. I think that this suffocation is, in a way, the key, because either it leads us to despair and we will just sink into again a destruction, not of a beautiful kind. There can be perhaps beautiful destruction when nature plays its part, but this is an ugly and sordid destruction. Or else it becomes in many, and what kind of critical mass are we aiming at is you know, something that the divine alone knows. It becomes an instrument for change. It becomes a call for the radical change without which humanity cannot move on to the spiritual age, which you know, Devdip was reminding us of. And this is the whole thing. Sri Aurobindo said it, Mother said it, nothing is going to change unless there is a radical change in consciousness. So at the individual level, we have all the keys, and it's for us to play our part. At the collective level, how is this going to happen? This is a great mystery to me. And perhaps this suffocation is one of the keys that will eventually force humanity to move to another stage. If that does not happen, well, we also know from Sri Aurobindo that this species will be overpassed, but in what ways and through what catastrophes is something, again, that we cannot predict. I know that this sounds like a gloomy message or interpretation. It's not, because I have no doubt whatsoever that we are moving, and despite appearances, this world is moving probably in the best possible manner, given the limitations, the obstinacy of this humanity. So probably the world is exactly as it should be, which is again something that Mother said somewhere. But we have this great boon that we know that we can collaborate in the change. Many humans do not know this. They feel helpless, they feel lost, they feel despondent, and they do not see where the light can come from. So we can only eventually come back to the work that the individual can do on itself. And perhaps that is the best way to help humanity in the end. I think I will stop here. And again, we can get back to some of these points if need be during the discussion.
Thank you, Michel. So we have the two poises of interesting counters, what Devdip started with, and then of course Michel giving us the picture as it is today, and of course the hope that it will change. These are very interesting, ideas that have come together, and I think there is a harmony between them. I will ask Gautam to present his presentation on unity now.
Thank you, Ameeta ji. Always a pleasure to be with the Gnostic Centre. This is one of the bright sparks in an otherwise gloomy picture that Michel ji just pointed out to, and my heart began to sink. And it's with great difficulty that I'm trying to go back to what Devdip said, into whose head, because of my age and because he's my co-editor, I can bang optimism. But with Michel ji, I will come and see you sometime and hope to change your approach. I'm more of an optimist. I'm also more in the real, what is known as the real world. And so my talk is going to be taking what Devdip and Michel ji have said, maybe one step forward or not, I don't know. Maybe it's in the same way. In fact, I'm quite amused to see that all three of us are actually talking about the same thing, and that shows the integrality of our Guru, of Sri Aurobindo, of the sage of the future. Like, you cannot talk about one thing without taking another. You can't talk about the individual, for instance, without embracing the collective. I'm going to talk about unity. I think it's the biggest challenge that we are facing today. Russia, Ukraine is a great power politics, or let's say a sidelined power politics. China, US is a great power politics. It's showing up in various ways. Both these are affecting all of us, all countries, individuals, nations, collectives, communities. Decoupling with China, that's another problem that's happening, and where China is offering us goods, but we cannot decouple because of from its authoritarianism, despite all attempts to do so. There are internal discords that we see. In Australia, you have Aborigines versus whites. In Europe, you have Christians versus Muslims. In US, you have blacks versus whites. In West Asia, you have Muslims versus Muslims. In China, you have the state versus the people. In Africa, tribes versus tribes. In South America, worldwide, we have women versus men, poor versus rich, Rajasic drives versus Tamasic mass, democracies versus authoritarianism, leaders that thrive on division, people that vote for tiny benefits, media that prospers on hate, hate that grows beyond control. All of it comes together and it gets captured in some form of a disunity, disharmony within, because we keep reading, we keep engaging, we meet people, we talk to our friends abroad, we talk to our relatives, our loved ones, we have views, opinions. Even in Auroville, there is the government versus Auroville, and within Auroville, Aurovillians versus Aurovillians. So I think conflict is very much part of what's happening today. What I see is in Sri Aurobindo's ideas on unity, on the one side, which is the ideal of human unity, and that's the book from which mostly I'll be talking about other areas as well. I'll be gleaning ideas from, but also I would like to situate this in context of a rising India and an India that is rediscovering itself, or an India that hopes to re-express itself, its essence. And I think that could be the saving grace for our planet. Because everywhere else, including in India, by the way, there is discord. But the rise of the Indian way, the Indian ideas, the Indian spirituality, philosophy, and in general, and Sri Aurobindo's, who is the sage of the future in particular, I feel I'm very much hopeful. We've been talking about unity since 1815, when the first concert of Europe, the first phase of the concert of Europe began. That failed. The second phase of the concert of Europe began in 1880. That failed. The League of Nations came into being in 1919. That failed. The United Nations began in 1939 after the World Wars, and that too is now failing. The quest for unity has remained. The expressions of that quest have changed at one level, and at another, perhaps nothing has changed. Nobody is able to unite that planet, our planet, not as a people, certainly not as a consciousness. This is disappointing on the one hand and appalling on the other. Disappointing because never has so much progress on every front happened in the past century, from healthcare to communication to food to travel to literature, ideas, governance. You take any activity and its impact, its depth, its ability to transform has been humongous. And this is appalling at the same time, because despite these advances, we find that the essential stuff of which the humanity is made has remained the same. It might be difficult to believe that we are living in the most peaceful time ever, but it's a fact. But despite that, the dominant discourse across the world is of tension, conflict, competition, power politics, and now war. Everything that points to a division is staring us in the face. New attempts at uniting the human race are happening, almost one at the rate of one grouping every year. G20, G7, G2, G8, Quad, BIMSTEC, SARC, Shanghai Corporation, and so on. But we are getting nowhere. What is happening is that the aspiration for unity, which both Devdip and Michel ji talked about, the aspiration for unity is making agendas in these groupings heavier, unfortunately delivering very little. These aspirations and attempts need to be respected, but when outcomes remain elusive, when unity remains obscure, we need to seek solutions beyond the visible. And even in this mental age, we find that the mind is being subjugated by the vital that has in turn been captured by barbaric forces. Where do we go? Sri Aurobindo gives us a few answers. First, while it is possible to construct a precarious and quite mechanical unity by political and administrative means, the unity of the human race, even if achieved, can only be secured and can only be made real if the religion of humanity, which is at present the highest active ideal of mankind, spiritualizes itself and becomes the inner law of human life. Our approach, therefore, is our limitation. The outside in has failed through all these institutions that I talked about, through all the journeys, through all the aspirations that I've just recited. Perhaps it is time for an inside out. Second, Sri Aurobindo also talks about the two forces needed for a larger aggregation. First, the closeness of common interests that will run over hurdles. War, for instance, and its futility may give in to peace and its benefits. And if this does not work, Sri Aurobindo says, and I quote, nature will use other means such as war and conquest, or the temporary domination of the powerful state or empire, or the menace of such a domination, which will compel those threatened to adopt a closer system of union. Are these groupings that I talked about and a few commas or a few dotted lines towards that goal? I don't know. The second force is a common uniting sentiment. But as we have seen over the past 75 years of the union, of the attempt at a unity through the United Nations, the centripetal force underlying uniting sentiment exists, But more often than not, it is smothered by a dividing centrifugal force. These centripetal and centrifugal forces in relation to social sciences is I attribute it to Sri Aurobindo. Nobody has used it earlier. Here, I would also like to look at the idea of power in Sri Aurobindo's context. Michel mentioned money from Sri Aurobindo's book, The Mother. I talk about power, which he talks about in the same breath. Power, Sri Aurobindo states, is one of the three forces that have the strongest attraction for the human ego and the asura, and are more generally misheld and misused by those who retain them. Can we see that happening? Definitely yes. A lot of leaders that I see, some of whom I engage with, I find that they don't have power. Power has them. And it's clear that more and more power is leading to more and more capture of their minds, which means we need to examine power and work towards spiritualizing it. The third point that I want to talk about is Sri Aurobindo further states, and I quote, "A spiritual religion of humanity is the hope of the future. This religion," he says, "will look beyond creed, intellectual beliefs, dogma, and rites." He elaborates the necessary conditions, the realization by the individual that only in the life of his fellow men lies his own life complete, and the realization by the race that only on the free and full life of the individual can its own perfection and permanent happiness be founded. He then takes these two and demands, and I quote, "a discipline and a way of salvation in accordance with this religion." That is to say, a means by which it can be developed by each man within himself so that it may be developed in the life of the race. Finally, all this may seem very far-fetched today, and it probably is. But Sri Aurobindo is the supramental sage, the seer of the future, the rishi from the future. Howsoever feeble the outward attempts, and howsoever lofty the uniting goal, the aspiration, Sri Aurobindo concludes that this spiritual unity must be our aspiration. But it must not get in the way of progress, even as the higher hope of humanity lies in a growing number of people embracing this spiritual unity. Until then, I quote, he says, "the attempt to bring it about by mechanical means must proceed." In other words, all our outside in institutions that we keep talking about, that we keep creating, that we keep demanding more from, for instance, the G20. What people are demanding from the G20 today is nothing less than what is demanded from the United Nations. But G20 does not have the legitimacy of a United Nations, while United Nations has the legitimacy, but is enfeebled by its own internal contradictions. But until then, Sri Aurobindo says we need to keep pushing, and perhaps until we reach that stage of consciousness, or the stage of awareness, or the realization that if we don't do it, nature will do it in her brutal ways. We may need to continue the march. Stepping back, finally, I am very hopeful. I think over the next decade, this decade, a lot of things are going to change. A lot of institutions are going to come up. Within the institution, there could be new ways of examining them, looking them, studying them, working with them. And I think India, a rising India, has a big, big role to play in this, particularly in taking Sri Aurobindo's vision forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gautam. Thank you. I think some of the ideas that struck me while listening to all three of you, which I would like to highlight here before, asking for your comments and throwing up some questions, is one, the idea that Devdip started with, which is the idea of liberty, the importance of freedom. Interestingly, he touched upon purity, but I think that's an extremely important aspect of freedom and liberty, which is, to be able to have sufficient purity in the vital being, which is the problem as I see it today. And the importance, of course, of the transference of will from a mental idealism to a spiritual idealism. Michel's idea of bringing, the idea that it is crushing circumstances that will force humanity and society towards this this change of consciousness is something that of course he highlighted, which of course the mother herself said, which he mentioned several times, which I found very, very important. What these crushing circumstances are they taking place today, are questions that I will leave the panelists and all of you to mull on, especially in the light of what Gautam said when he highlighted the various conflicts that are taking place in the world, whether the Russia-Ukraine war, the several, conflicting religions, sex, so on. I mean, it's everywhere. You can just see conflict when you open the newspaper. So the question is, will humanity wake up on its own, or will it require, as Michel said, a certain suffocation, and as Mother said, a crushing circumstances? Is the supramental descent and the supramental force strong enough to inwardly change, our consciousness enough to create or want to create outward institutions of unity and collaboration, which I see that is happening in the world. There is a need for collaboration and harmony, which is so much the hallmark of the 21st century, which we didn't see in the 20th century. The 20th century was marked by this incredible individualism to the detriment of any kind of collaboration and harmony. Today, I think nations realize they can't exist unless they coexist with each other. Partnerships are the key model. Companies, in the same way, businesses are also doing the same, amalgamating, which doesn't mean that they are not going towards, that there is not selfishness there. But what I'm trying to highlight is that there is both these forces that are playing out, in the world, which have all these trends of unity, disruption, disharmony, conflict, freedom, collaboration, need for coexistence. And my question to the panelists is simply, how do you see, in the light of what you've spoken about, the inner change coming about in society? We can see the signs of it now, but what will it take for that next step? Will it be something that flowers from within, or will it be something that pushes from without? And if it is both, then what is it? I asked also the panelists to comment and to give their views on what they've heard their co-panelists speak about, and maybe highlight important ideas. So shall I ask Devdip, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to both Michel ji and Gautam. And I think that this ability to perceive the challenges of the present moment, while at the same time hold on to the hope and faith in a changing world leading to a more spiritual future, is something which is intrinsic to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo's approach. Because the term spiritual realism refers to the recognition of the challenges ahead as well as looking at it from a perspective of, inner unity, knowledge, truth. So I feel that my own take on this issue is, I am aware and I recognize, and I very much agree with Michel ji about the difficulties that he highlights. And I also love very much the lines that he quoted, which remind us that very often the outer appearances create conditions in which progress can take place more rapidly. At the same time, I retain also the optimism of Gautam. And I feel that, I'm reminded of this message that the mother gave about the supramental world. This is much later, of course. She says the coming of this, I think the supramental world is not announced by beat of drum. The idea that there's so much work that happens silently. And personally, I do not have the insight to say that, look, I know that this is taking place, but I have the faith, and I do feel in my interactions with people, in my engagements, not just in the Sri Aurobindo and mother community, but also outside of it, I see that in different ways, in different spaces, following different methods, people are seeking, people are striving to change the world in whichever way they can. And I do believe that there is a sincerity in that attempt to change things and move towards a better future. It is true that this is perhaps still a very small minority of people, perhaps in the large movements of human mass, it's a small blip. But from the perspective of consciousness, I think there are still important centers of change taking place everywhere. And even the conflicts that Gautam mentioned, he spelled them out so well. Even in those conflicts, essentially various opportunities. We know that even in our own communities, whether it's in the ashram or in Auroville, there are so many challenges, different perspectives, and yet each of these moments can be moments of great, individual change, because you're forced, your ordinary worldview and reality are somewhat shaken. So you're forced to kind of re-anchor and tether yourself to some deeper truth of your being. And that can be a very powerful, impetus for progress. And at the same time, it also compels you to engage in the collective sense more meaningfully, to rethink, why is this happening? Because anything that takes place is the result of deep-rooted tendencies. When we read Sri Aurobindo's social and political writings, this comes through very strongly, that everything is a play of forces. These forces have to be understood and perceived, and they have their own sort of, life to run out. So in brief, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's important to recognize the challenges and to see just how complex and dangerous the world can be. And at the same time, also see that there is a growing movement of change and willingness to seek for some greater truth.
Thank you. Michel, any comments? Or...
So I think, again, Devdip has put it very nicely. I think we basically all of three of us are pretty much saying the same thing in three different ways. That's about it. To me, what this, supramental or this new element, which has been injected in the material world by Sri Aurobindo and the mother, what it is certainly doing, and they have said so, maybe not exactly in these words, it is disrupting the old order. It has to, because if the old order is not disrupted, then there is no chance of a positive line of change. Very clearly, we have two curves in humanity. So Devdip has spoken of people awakening, people trying to do, work of a positive nature, that is to say, open to the future. And yes, there are more and more of them. I completely agree. And that is certainly a sign of hope. So I'm neither pessimistic nor optimistic. I'm trying to move beyond these two notions, because they are inherently limited. Now, certainly there is this awakening simply out of the world circumstances, or simply out of a sheer inner awakening. Whatever the cause, it is happening. But we also see the old order fiercely defending itself, fiercely. And we see it extremely well in the world of international business. For example, how all these supranational entities constantly and effectively sabotage all the possible, international agreements, treaties on environment, and it is so urgent because the environment is changing so fast, faster than we are told. I'm convinced of this. So we see those two curves. One is hanging on to the past, and the other is trying to move towards the future. And I see the same thing at the level of India. I agree with Gautam that India is rising, India is awakening, and has a role to play. We were told that. And of course, because India's roots are deeper than those of any other surviving culture, it has a potential role to play. Is it playing it today? I do not know, because there again, I see the two curves. I see an awakening. I see many people attempting at, usually silently, they're not very often in the newspaper titles, trying to change things, and with true methods, true means, which invoke higher values, right? But we see also part of this so-called awakening hanging on to so-called traditions, pretty ignorant of what those traditions actually are, but invoking those traditions, saying we must, we must stick to our traditions and they are our salvation. And that actually is a dangerous attitude, because, Aurobindo told us again and again that we have to break the mold of the past, but preserve the spirit of the past achievements for the future. And he also said more specifically about Indian cultural heritage, that it was living in an unfit body and needed to be reborn. So we can also see there the two trends, and therefore, it's this very tricky equation between the two at the global level, at the level of India. Sometimes at our own internal level, we can see the contradictions in ourselves. It's not very hard to see, I think, most of the time. So this is basically where everything is going to be at stake. And I think the divine alone knows how to handle those impossible equations, because they have no mathematical solution, no human solution. And there's only a divine solution somewhere. And I'm sure we're moving towards it in whatever devious ways humanity is capable of. So this is my concluding remark.
Yoga must be revealed to mankind if mankind is to take the next step in human evolution. Gautam, you spoke about the role of India. Yoga, of course, Sri Aurobindo meant in the integral yoga perspective. How do you think India can play a role in bringing forward one of the most important messages Sri Aurobindo gave? Gautam?
Yeah, I'm just noting your question. You surprised me by asking a new question.
Yes.
I thought I'll just take the old question forward.
I thought that was sufficiently answered. So I
yeah. So India and Sri Aurobindo, taking them forward, I think that's the easy part. I think the fact that our book was published, Reading Sri Aurobindo, the fact that it has received such a fantastic response, the fact that even today we keep getting messages that this chapter has changed my life, that chapter has changed my life. I wish this would have happened, that would have happened, shows that Sri Aurobindo is here in a far more, not dominant, but a far more assertive manner that he should have been. He had been cancelled for the past 150 years. And I think now with this book and this time, I wouldn't say this book actually, I think it's the time of disharmony, the time of disunity, divisions, the time of this kind of serial disruptions that the world is facing. Sri Aurobindo is here. Our Prime Minister comes to the ashram and bows before Sri Aurobindo. Many other ministers do. So I think at the political level too, there is a greater harmony, and it is not a ritualistic. He has no reason to do so. There is a deeper harmony here. I think the politics is changing. I can see from where I sit as part of several Indic groups spread across India, many across the world. Sri Aurobindo is coming out. 2 days ago, I met a young student. I was giving a lecture on my other book, Reform Nation, at the Delhi University. And this young man came up to me and said, I came to know that you were giving a lecture, so I'm here. And I want to tell you that I'm doing my PhD thesis on Sri Aurobindo. And after Mr. Karan Singh, this is the second PhD thesis that will come from this university. Karan Singh did his PhD, I don't know, several decades ago, this huge vacuum. And now we have a young man who is pursuing his PhD. His thesis is something to do with Sri Aurobindo, Sanatan Dharma, and nationalism. So he came for some guidance, etc. So I see Sri Aurobindo rising. I see Sri Aurobindo going to France through Devdip. I see Sri Aurobindo going to the US through various universities. I see Sri Aurobindo coming out. My own paper, which I'm writing on democracy right now, has Sri Aurobindo prominently figured as part of a political philosophy. So I think when I say Sri Aurobindo is here, it is not just an aspiration or a wishful thinking or a deep conviction that it must be done. I can actually see it happening. I'm part of the process, and the process has now become a part of me. It's become larger than me. It's become larger than us. The rise of India will contain in itself the rise of Sri Aurobindo's ideas. There is no other option. There is no other way. The two are interlinked. I also wanted to take a minute or two of the previous question, which is the supramental change going to bring this change? And Michel seemed pessimistic, and Devdip a little optimistic, and Michel was balanced and all of that. I just want to show you some data, which is that in the pre-war period, there were united interests. The great wars happened, the wars finished, it became a bipolar world with the USSR and the US as the two power points. After the implosion of USSR, it became bipolar again in the mid-80s between US and China. US enjoyed a monopoly, great power for a few decades, and now there is China and US. Today, with the rise of India, we are looking at a greater multipolarity. So already from a single power to a dual power to a multipolarity, we are already seeing some kind of a stratification of the manner in which if we just step back from individual nations and look at us as a humanity, as a people, we are already seeing that what Sri Aurobindo mentioned and which I talked about, the interest groups coming together. And this is one of the forces that is happening. This is the centripetal force. You may call it centripetality within centrifugality. That is, there are several pockets of multipolarities working together. So in the Shanghai Corporation, India works with China. In the Quad, India works with United States, and both are fine. In G20, India works with both of them. So I think this multipolarity that is happening is part of a consciousness which is of nations, of leaders who are seeing the futility of discord. Every nation wants to be wealthy. Every nation wants to be powerful. But the discord that accompanies it is, I think, on its way out, including perhaps in China, although China to me is a rogue nation and it will need to prove its antecedents far better than what we see today. Environment, which Michel talked about, has been co-opted. Environment now, everybody's green is good. Every balance sheet attempts to go green. Every country is trying to reduce its carbon footprint. At the same time, in the quest for co-opting environment into this multipolarity or a greater consciousness or a wider consciousness and an engagement with the planet, however, we need to be aware of the dangers that a few corporations or a few countries like China are monopolizing the solar panel business. We need to break that, and it will get broken. So if we are talking about electric cars, we are actually subsidizing China. If we are talking about other technologies, we are subsidizing the US and the Western countries. So I think those divisions are beginning to surface, which we need to crush at this moment. And I think India is on that job. For instance, the manner in which it is conducting its 5G and 6G researches. Finally, I see technology, the fact that we are sitting on this platform with 54 participants and talking from across the world, perhaps if not across this country, shows that as a technology, with all its evils, with all its control problems, with all this manipulating of the minds, etc., is also an enabling idea of consciousness, which allows us to sit together, discuss, agree or disagree, debate, come up with new ideas, engage with one another's consciousness, and move forward. I think technology, the manner in which technology has raced ahead in the past 2 decades is a phenomenal thing. Now, like any force, it can be Asuric or it can be Devic, and we need to ensure that the Asuric part of the force does not end up controlling this wonderful uniting entity. Yeah, thank you.
Good, thank you. So we can now open to questions from the audience, and also you could put up your hands to ask. Anything on the chat box?
Yeah, there is a question.
Yes.
You want me to read it out?
Yes, please.
Sri Aurobindo doesn't represent any religion. However, by associating him with political personalities, it is hazardly misleading and unfairly diminishing his great teachings. How can this be avoided? This is from Yamini.
Okay. May I request Devdip to answer that?
No, I agree with there are 2 parts to that question. One, that he doesn't represent any religion, which is certainly true because he strove to go beyond any kind of religious form towards spiritual teaching and truth. At the same time, he does not, in the same way, reject religion either. There is he sees the role and place that religion has had in the development of humanity, but moving forward into the future, clearly, even if the foundation of his teachings are based on the Sanatana Dharma and the profound wisdom and knowledge, spiritual knowledge traditions of India, he puts forth a perspective which is not tied down to any limited form. So that is certainly correct. Associating him with political personalities, I'm not sure what exactly the questioner means. Perhaps she's referring to the reference to the visit, people coming to the ashram who may be in senior positions of political power. I think, Gautam should ideally take that question, but I think what Gautam was trying to highlight, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is the fact that there is opening to the influence of Sri Aurobindo and his message. Of course, people take what they can, and it's a long work ahead even for us who have been associated with Sri Aurobindo and the mother for so many years. I feel, speaking for myself, that I'm still, growing and learning more and more, growing into the vastness of their consciousness, because it far exceeds whatever our limited perspectives are able to take from it. So I agree that there is a problem where people take what they want. At the same time, I think the point we are making is that there is a genuine thirst and seeking for that knowledge. And any linking of Sri Aurobindo to a specific perspective, viewpoint, religion, party is always very problematic. Because when you read his writings, you find that he approaches truth from many different multiple perspectives. So the approach is contingent not only on, when he writes, for example, for whom he is writing, the context in which he is writing, the time when he was writing that. And also, truths themselves evolve and change with the passage of time. So all of these have to be kept in mind when we talk about Sri Aurobindo in relation to either religion or politics or anything of that nature.
Thank you, Devdip. There's another question. in terms of contextualizing the spiritual realism, what suggestion would you give for ensuring the conflict in India relates to the mental idealism, and what would be the way out to achieve the spiritual unity? Who would like to take this question?
This is totally Devdip's question. He used that expression.
Yes. So let me just read out one or two more, and then maybe we could ask all of you to maybe take up aspects of them. So Gautam so eloquently talked about the Asuric forces dividing the world order, but it seems that the world leaders are being led by the powers of egoism. I'm hoping that the world embraces the teaching of Sri Aurobindo and changes happen in the next decade. Namaskaram. Sri Aurobindo, the world is an expression of Ananda, bliss. This has been misinterpreted as connecting with ethical hedonism. Example, utilitarianism as a tally, a pain and pleasure, suffering and happiness. But maybe rasa is the really operative concept. The world is a place of developing beauty and of centers of consciousness as appreciating beauty. So I think these are the few. Have I missed out anything important here? You could.
There is one from Nishi.
Nishi, where is that?
Right above the one that you read. My takeaway is that.
Yes, my takeaway is that for taking the next steps for myself, I need to read and understand Sri Aurobindo. I have tried and found it hard. Any suggestions? Where could I begin? Okay, so who would like to take what? Panelists can decide their own questions they want to answer. Michelle, would you like to say something?
Nishi's question is a classic one. I think we've heard it, all of us, hundreds of times. How do I start reading Sri Aurobindo? Depends on your own taste. You know, some people jump into Savitri. I'm surprised myself. I've seen people taking Savitri as the very first work of Sri Aurobindo, which is not by any means the easiest. When students ask me, I usually advise them to read Letters on Yoga, because it is, you know, these are briefer texts, more pointed. I mean, the way they've been organized, more pointed to very specific issues and features of the inner transformation. So Letters on Yoga, and of course there are many collections of them. But if you're poetically inclined, you could take his poetry, or if you are socially inclined, you can take the Human Cycle, Ideal of Human Unity. It's endless. If you are philosophically inclined, you can take the Life Divine, of course. And you know, there is no single answer. It depends on your own bent of research and mental development also.
May I try, Ameeta, answering this question? Because I've been asked this question at least 2,854 times. So like Michel said, if you are philosophically inclined, you can try the Life Divine and others. I would slightly express a little bit of caution. I think if you are philosophically inclined, I would suggest with essays in philosophy and yoga, or essays divine and human, because these are short 1-page, 2-page, 3-page small essays. They contain in them the entire essence. Every paragraph is loaded with consciousness. It is loaded with insights, but it talks in an easy to grasp and touch manner. For a person who is politically inclined, I would say Bande Mataram and Karma Yogin would be good starting points. For poetry, before they venture to Savitri, I would say collected poems, maybe a softer entry point. Life Divine, they should not touch unless they have been taught by Devdip, or they have gone through some of his earlier works, because even reading a para out there can be extremely challenging. The one book that I always carry with myself is that small booklet called The Mother, 6 simple chapters, profound. It's always there in my pocket. Wherever I travel, wherever I go, this book accompanies me, and I've read it so many times, and every time it cleanses me from within. It offers me insights that I hadn't seen the previous time, even though I know the book almost verbatim. Once you are through with all this, it is then that you get into scriptural works or the deeper philosophical works like the Life Divine, Synthesis of Yoga, Secret of the Veda, the Upanishads, etc. This would be my pathway to you. And this is not to sell the book because you can borrow it from somewhere else. What we have done in reading Sri Aurobindo is encapsulated in 2,000 words every book of Sri Aurobindo. And so you can get an essence of what these 36 volumes are all about, and choose the one that engages with you. I was in fact surprised that one of our readers began with Record of Yoga. So now that's a very tough book, but that's what they found to be interesting after reading a book. So I think each in his own journey and stage of consciousness. And in fact, I would say Sri Aurobindo gets you to pick up the book that he wants you to read.
Good. So, anybody else would like to? There's another question. Can the key ideas of today be summarized so that can we summarize the key ideas from today's session that society, non-followers of Sri Aurobindo in general, would need, and the possible approaches to get it done? Have you understood? I think somebody's asking for the summary of the key ideas that have been taken up today. Would any
That's
of you
the executive summary, Ameeta. That's your job.
Okay, I will do that. Before I do that, any other responses from anyone?
I think we have to realize that humanity is forced into a collective yoga. You know, Sri Aurobindo spoke of India undergoing a national yoga, but now it is really at the global level. And you know, in a yoga, there are methods. There is an aspiration, which is the whole key to it. If there is no aspiration, there's not going to be any progress. So whatever the motivations, I think this is one key idea that, you know, when Sri Aurobindo said all life is yoga, this actually applies today to our current world situation more than ever, I would say. So this is one key idea I would offer.
There was a question of Stephen Phillips about bliss and rasa, Ananda and rasa, and it's a very profound question, and I think it's also very important. I don't know whether we have the scope and time to really go into a detailed discussion of that, but I just want to touch upon. I just want to add a little bit that when Sri Aurobindo speaks about Ananda. Again, it depends on the context and the usage of the term, but when it is spoken of as one of the essential operative planes of consciousness, Satchit Ananda, the field and the plane of bliss, I mean, rasa, and of course, rasa and bliss are closely related, but I would just say that it goes beyond just rasa. Rasa is more a translation that takes place in the human field of consciousness. And what I can suggest is for those of you who are interested in this discussion about aesthetics, bliss, rasa, ananda, that there are 2 chapters. I mean, there is a whole discussion in the Life Divine, but even considering that we were talking about the human cycle, there is a chapter in the human cycle which speaks about supra-rational beauty and how, you know, the translation of beauty in suprarational planes also takes place at the human level, and this would require Ameeta a whole different evening to get together and talk about. But I just wanted to highlight that distinction between bliss and rasa.
If I may add a quick note here, you know, this is also rooted in 2 essential Indian ideas, which of course Sri Aurobindo builds upon in his own way. One is, you know, that the Judeo-Christian thought is that humans are born in sin, and they are children of sin in a way, and then they have to, you know, redeem themselves, etc., etc. The Indian idea is absolutely opposite. You know, we are Amritasya Putraha. We are the son, we are the children of bliss. So the starting point, the foundation is completely different. And in a way, it is that truth which ultimately we need to recover. Secondly, there is also this old, Indian aphorism of Satyam Shivam Sundaram. The Sundaram beauty is an integral part of right living, founded on truth, on goodness, auspiciousness, and on beauty. And this has always been a very strong constant feature of the classical Indian thought, that beauty is integral to life and to a meaningful life. And this is something certainly modern life tends to lose sight of, no doubt.
Lovely line in Savitri, beauty is the footprint where he has walked. So the importance of beauty. Yes, I want to touch upon just a few ideas were sort of talked about, but I thought they're very important to bring back to the center. One was the idea that we briefly spoke about is what is divinity? What is spirituality? I think the idea, if one has to really understand the vision of Sri Aurobindo and the thought of Sri Aurobindo, this is a very central concept or central theme of his work, which is what is divine? What is spiritual? Is there a difference between spirit and matter? Or is matter nothing but spirit, which is infused into a material reality, and spirit nothing but matter that has materialized in itself? So which brings us to the central idea that of Sri Aurobindo and of the yoga, that all life is yoga, that Michel spoke about. And then these ideas can all weave themselves around it of if everything is divine and can be turned to the divine, even if it is even if it is obscure and at the moment entrenched in egoism or ignorance or darkness or inconscience. However, because of its very root and its very substance being divine, can therefore turn to the divine, which makes money, business, power, politics, everything a field of yoga. Then the importance of these ideas that we discussed today becomes very, very interesting. The idea of freedom and liberty, which was brought up, the transference of will that can only take place if that the very substance and the core is spiritual and divine. The idea that that there is, the obstinacy and the Asuricness that Michel brought about, of the unwillingness to change of certain parts of humanity, but also certain parts of ourselves. When we want to change a habit or a problem in our own nature, how difficult it is to do that. The obstinacy that is at the root of this conflict is something that exists individually as well as collectively. But again, this idea that it's there so that it can be transformed and can be divinized to its completeness. Then the idea of what was brought about as the importance of crushing circumstances, the collective yoga, and then what Gautam brought about is the various hues of conflict, the various movements that have been taking part in the world from the beginning of history right up to the modern age, the institutions that have been created only to be broken and recreated, and of course the optimism of the fact that India holds the soul of the world. Its very purpose, as Gautam very rightly put, is to lead humanity to the new next age, and which is why great leaders and great sages like Sri Aurobindo and the mother have come here and have been born in this country. So these were some of the ideas that came up at least in my consciousness. And if I've left any, those can certainly be added. So with that, I would like to close this wonderful session and thank the panelists for their time and for the wisdom and the knowledge that has been collectively formed, which brings more than just, it's not just a sum of 3 panelists, but something that adds much more to it. And also to announce that for this coming year, we are planning to take up 4 themes in the webinars. The first theme we took up today, the ideas. The second theme is going to be taken up on the 29th of April, which is a webinar on the music of tomorrow. We spoke about the importance of art, music, beauty, aesthetics. So that will be taken up then in a webinar where we have some world-renowned musicians coming. Sylvia Nakash, who's won the Grammy, and Yuval Ron, who's done fantastic work in healing, music for healing, and so on. And then from there we go on to the next webinar, which is on a new education for a new world, which is the third theme that we want to take up. And then around Sri Aurobindo's birthday, the important theme, webinar on business, money, and wealth. And we hope to culminate next year, somewhere in February, March, at a, to organize an on-site festival and conference, which encapsulates all these 4 themes and takes them to the next level. So I thank you very much for being here with us, and we hope to see you again on the 29th of April. And I would like you all to give a great moment of deep thanks to the 3 panelists who have come here today to join us. Thank you so much. We end with 1 minute of silence and homage to Sri Aurobindo. Thank you.